Welcome to Emma Honey Podcast. Thank you for tuning in as always. Thank you for listening. I'm going to be going solo on this one and talking about spring scouting. So this is, again, just my own, breakdown of how I scout in the springtime. Now we are kind of getting to the, that transition between kind of what I would consider kind of spring scouting, tactics and what I'm looking at or looking for anyways. And then leading into more of the summertime, scouting, where they both kind of have their own, unique ways to go about it. I really like focusing more on springtime. A lot more of that science available to be able to see. Once everything kind of greens up and everything's just going back in again, it does make it a little bit harder to see some of that sign from the season before. And then it's kind of the focus kind of changes a little bit more of, basically trying to get eyes on deer and not necessarily focusing on fall time sign. But again, so that's just what we're going to do today. But before we get into the topic of the scouting, I do want to cover some key dates and seasons that are open currently in Michigan. So let's go ahead and get into those. So currently, again, still we have the turkey season still going on. It's basically the third and final season for most of the state. So that runs through again until May 31st. Now there are a couple areas that do have a little bit later season that run through June 7th, but those are in select areas. So again, always check your regs on if that is in your area. And then of course they have, kind of the other miscellaneous animals that are still kind of year round. You got possum, porcupine, weasel, red squirrel, skunk, ground squirrel, woodchuck, Russian boar, feral pigeon, sterling, and house sparrow. Again, any of those can be taken year round as long as you have a valid base license. But one thing I really want to make sure I highlight is that it is the bear and elk application period that runs through May 1st all the way to June 1st. So if you are wanting to get in for any of those drawings, again, the bears is a point system. So, again, I'm looking at getting closer to the higher echelon of those points to potentially be able to draw for my area. The elk, again, is a true lottery. Now, for both of those, the results for both those drawings is going to be held on or available online on June 24th. So just keep in mind on those dates for those two application periods. And then when it comes to fishing, again, we're looking at, things are kind of wrapping up or kind of ramping up for the summer. So we got largemouth and smallmouth bass. Again, that's open year round, but the possession period starts May 25th and runs through December 31st. Muskie is catch and release in all waters for the entire state right now. There's currently no open possession season. Northern pike and walleye, again, those have just opened up. So possession season for the lower peninsula, inland waters is started back in April 27th and runs through March 15th of next year. The season for the upper peninsula pushed back a little bit further. That opens up on May 15th and runs through March 15th as well. Salmon and trout is open right now. So possession and fishing seasons for inland type 1 and 2 streams is open. And for the inland lakes as well, that is also open. Again, check your local or check the fishing digest to make sure that you are, for the certain waters that you want to fish, that those seasons are open, and for the the Pacific size limits and whatnot for those bodies of water, and even that for the gear restrictions as well. And then of course, as always, we have the channel catfish, flathead catfish, Cisco, whitefish, smell, sunfish, white bass, yellow perch, and other species. All our game species are open the entire year as well. All right, and then one last thing I wanted to cover that I hadn't covered previously, which I should have, was, for the Total Archery Challenge. It looks like for this year that the registration is still open. However, it looks like they're completely sold out for any of the shoot times. So for me, I'm probably not gonna spend a ton of time down over at Crystal Mountain for the total archery challenge that I usually do. Again, I just I dropped the ball on getting registered and setting up shoot times. So I still will be down there checking it out. Probably shoot down at the range a little bit. Just kind of catch up with everybody down there. So if you did get registered, congratulations. You're gonna have some fun. Again, if you haven't registered, you can still go down there and see all the vendors and do some of the other shoots for winning prizes and just to shoot for fun at one of the ranges. Sometimes a lot of the vendors will have prizes for those as well. So hope to see you at that. Again, that is from that's June 5th, 6th, and 7th, I believe. Again, double check the date on that. I may be off a little bit. All right, and as always, before we get into the scouting, make sure if you like this episode, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, share this show with your friends, and head on over to mihuntingpodcast.com to see the full collection of all the content available, as well as check out the merchandise. And as always, if you want to support this show more directly, head on over to the Join Us button, click Become a Member. Your membership supports this show directly, gets you access to special member-only discounts, content, as well as a special prize for signing up. All right, so let's get into the topic at hand with spring scouting. So main things I'm really focusing on for spring scouting is, basically trying to look at, or trying to find as much of the sign from the previous fall or previous hunting season. And the two areas that I really focus on is looking at the cover in comparison to food. So the very first step that I take when doing any type of scouting, whether it's a brand new location or even if it's an area that I've scouted before, I always go back to my eMaps or map systems or whatever mapping app you use and kind of look at the lay of the land again and kind of just look at the bigger picture, that 50,000 foot view of the area to kind of reanalyze what I've already have scouted. If it is an area that I've scouted before, or if it's a brand new area, I start looking at areas of interest. So a couple things I do right away is I look at the different mapping layers and kind of determine the type of cover that's in there. Is it open field? Is it timbered? Does it appear to be hardwood versus evergreens or conifers? And depending on the kind of the area or my familiarity with the area, I may switch up those layers of those mapping systems. A lot of times they have different filters that you can put into it. One of my favorite ones is doing the monthly satellite. That one, again, you lose a lot of the detail. It's kind of pixelated and whatnot, but you get to see a lot of the coloration. So, in the summertime, you can see everything green up. Winter and fall, or fall time, everything's brown. In winter, you see a lot of white. But you can start to pinpoint areas that if it's a timbered area and it's all brown, or you've seen a bunch of white versus a bunch of green, then you kind of know the breakdown of the type of timber that makes up that cover. And then also there are some different filters that also have very, very detailed, high resolution. In Spartan Forge, in particular, they have the UAV, imaging. Again, that is super high def. You can zoom in very close to the ground and still get a high level of detail without everything getting all blurry on you. So if you really want to fine tune, find some really high resolution imagery, that way you can really zoom in and see, again, high detail. What I'm thinking about when it comes to the different types of cover, if you have, conifers versus hardwoods, those conifers or those evergreens, are going to offer that, thermal cover overhead with those full branches. So when it comes to like late season and whatnot, those are areas that are going to hold deer. And then depending on that type of tree it is, or how thick that cover is, or how low those branches are, sometimes if those trees get really bunched in together or they become very mature, then a lot of those branches just kind of die down below and start moving up. So I take that in consideration of that may be the case that there's not really good side cover or dense cover, but it's got the overhead cover that's going to hold, again, for thermal cover for those deer. And then when it comes to hardwoods, you're looking at high stem count typically, really good for side cover. So this is going to be that really thick, dense stuff that you can't see through. From there, once I've kind of determined the type of cover that's there, the next thing that I will do on every time I look at a map is pull up the contour lines or those topo maps to see what the terrain's doing. I put probably way more focus into terrain than I probably should, but it just seems to be the most consistent thing that I find when it comes to finding deer sign. Certain types of, I've walked, lots of different areas where there's been, really good cover and just the deer sign's not there. But then all of a sudden I find like an area where there's just, a slight change in elevation or a ditch or something that changes the elevation a little bit. And all of a sudden, boom, there's a bunch of sign. And I follow that contour line and that sign just follows along, with that terrain difference. Not so much even necessarily the cover difference. So if it goes from like, cedar swamp to more hardwood timber or softwood timber, that really doesn't matter as much to me anyways, in regards to, where those contour lines are. So again, looking at areas that really funnel movement is kind of one of the first things that catch my eye on those maps. So looking at steep hills, drainages that are going to funnel movement. So if you got a really steep ridge, there's a good likelihood that a lot of the deer are going to be funneling, along either the tops or the bottom of it. Now, again, if you look at where there's an area where it kind of seems like that slope kind of lessens up, you may see, deer are side hilling or using that little bit of a bench or not nearly as steep of a slope of that hill to kind of cut that hill sideways. So that's one thing to look at. But if it looks like it's just super steep, like a big, really deep, drop off essentially, then those deer are going to try to, utilize that. They're going to walk around, that steeper terrain than try to climb it. But again, that's only if it's very steep. There's some hills that, you question that deer are going to climb it or not. And when you get there, you can definitely tell that, some of these steep hills that you think that they wouldn't want to climb, they do utilize them and climb them. They create these little, edges or these little trails going up the hill, usually again going at an angle, side hill, and you're not going to find very many that are going to go straight up a very steep hill, but you'll just see where they can where they've cut into that hillside. But what I usually do is, again, focus on either above or below and then look for sign from there. And then the other thing is too, I'm looking at the typical, look for benches, plateaus for, good bedding. Again, a lot of those can be very subtle, depending on where you're at. There's not really a ton of hilly terrain. So even just a elevation difference of just a few feet can really make a difference. There's one spot in particular that I just recently scouted, and, it's basically down in some really thick kind of like borderline cedar swamp. It's definitely had a lot of water still, hanging out. And I got to a spot where it was probably only a 2 to 3 foot difference in elevation, but all of a sudden the vegetation changed. It was a lot drier, and you could just tell the deer were up on this dry spot where not so much necessarily the cedar and like kind of flooded out pine. It all of a sudden turned into like more poplar trees. There were a couple oak trees up there. So just that little change in elevation, and bam, a bunch of deer sign. I found a bunch of rubs and scrapes, and you can definitely tell that they're utilizing that area with really 2 to 3 main trails that really cut through it and run along it. So once I've kind of determined some of those contour lines that kind of caught my eye, then I'm looking at some of those transitions. Again, looking at changes between the hardwoods and conifers, especially if you're looking at a stand of mature hardwoods or something like that, or some like row, red pine or something like that, where it's going to be kind of like an ecological desert where there's not going to be much in the center of that, unless again you either have a terrain difference or have like a deadfall or something that creates cover in the midst of it. There's really not going to be any significant sign in the middle of it. Again, focus on the transitions, focus on those edges. Don't necessarily have to say it, but again, the deer are creatures of edge, so focus on those edges. Next thing is timber harvest and clear cuts. Those are going to be great. Again, they're going to be going out into that timber or out in those clear cuts, getting that fresh growth of anything that's coming up from that after that clear cut. Again, focusing on the edge of that. The other thing you can look at too is, either selective, timber harvest or, TSI harvest, where they don't take all the trees. Again, you're going to get a lot of fresh growth coming through there, which is just going to draw the deer as well. So, and then with this too, like I'm basically pinning everything that I find that's anything worth, anything that caught my eye, I put a pin down. So I can either, investigate it later or, disregard it later. So I put a lot of pins down initially, and then from there I thin them out as I either, kind of analyze the spot more or get boots on ground. So, and right now, again, we're looking at kind of the later part of what I would consider the spring scouting time frame. I do like to do a lot more of it before spring green up occurs. You can a lot of the sign from the previous year is a lot more visible. It's not getting too hot. It's not getting too muggy. Bugs aren't bad. So that's typically where I spend a lot more time doing that spring scouting time frame. Now again, this time of year, again, you can kind of take advantage of the weather. If you're looking at like a really windy day or even a day that's going to have some rain in it, those are really good days to go out scout as well, because a lot of times you're going to end up running into more deer, especially if they're during that rain and during those high wind areas or time frames. Those deer you're probably going to bump them out of their beds a little bit more often when they're closer to you, or when you get closer to them, I guess I should say, and you're going to be able to pinpoint those bedding areas a little bit better. Sometimes if you go through when the weather's not as good, and then a lot of times those deer are going to move out of their bedding areas well before you get a chance to see them or hear them. So I kind of try to focus on some of those time frames when I can try to get in there and potentially bump some deer. Again, another scouting trip I already did this spring was scouting an area, and I was finding just a bunch of sign, a bunch of rubs, a couple of smaller scrapes, and it was on the edge of, there's a big hillside, an old TSI timber harvest, and then there's kind of like a swampy lowland area, so kind of like a cedar swampy area. It just seemed like a really good spot that was just, I noticed a big concentration of sign in the area, and just happened to start taking a few more steps, and all of a sudden bump deer out of a bed just up the hill from me. It was kind of side hill. Sure enough, went up there. There's a little tiny bench, a little tiny flat area. The deer was definitely bedded in that thicker cover. Basically, it was kind of like a pine area. Kind of side hill or halfway up this hill. It was overlooking, below it, and then based on the wind direction, the wind was blowing down towards the outward, off the top of the hill. So again, a very good spot for deer to be able to see what's in front of them and smell what's behind them. So once I get all the fun, mapping done and marking all my pins, again, you can spend a lot of time on. Basically, if it's a brand new spot, I like to, kind of go through kind of quickly and then slow down the moment I start seeing any good sign in the area. So what I really focus on is looking at those edges. So I'm basically taking the edges of either that clear cut or that timber harvest, or even the edge of the terrain differences. So again, looking for, main trails that are leading to thick cover. Again, it's going to get a little bit harder for some of the smaller trails that aren't being utilized as much now that things are starting to green up and grow and starting to grow quite a bit. But you are going to still see a lot of those main trails. The ones that are just like the cow path where you can, it's basically all dirt and running through. You'll still be able to focus on those. And also you'll look for areas that you're not able to see on the mapping system. I don't know how many times I've gone out and, it looks like a big stand of, pine trees, and all of a sudden you get in there and there's like a patch of like, birch saplings, or not birch saplings, like beech saplings, or, a different type of, a bunch of like pine saplings or something like that. There might have been a deadfall or just an opening in the canopy that allowed for other, trees to grow in there. You might find some random oaks in there as well, that you're just not going to be able to see on the mapping system. Those, especially if it's in a mature timber area, those are going to be almost 9 times out of 10, I think, where it's going to be a draw for deer movement. So if you walk up into that, you're probably going to see some browse. You're probably going to see some deer sign in there. I don't know what it is about, just that little pocket in there. It doesn't even have to be really big. It can only be like 20, 30 yards wide. But if you're in an acre of, mature timber that really doesn't have much of anything, is just wide open, that little pocket in the middle of that is gonna draw deer. And the biggest one is making note of any buck signs. So again, looking at any scrapes or rubs that are leading in and out of those cover areas. And again, the big ones I'm looking at is within the cover, looking for beds. Now, I'm still learning quite a bit of being able to analyze or find really good bedding areas, especially when it comes to, pinpointing if it's a buck bedding area or a doe bedding area. Again, looking at the bedding sizes, kind of the layout, the proximity to food. So again, if it's right on top of food or right by the edge of a food source, I usually consider that being probably more necessarily a doe bedding area, or doe bedding, or does be utilized in this bedding area. It just seems that those bucks are always going to be a little bit further off, where those does are always the closest ones to the food sources. And again, focus on the typical, buck sign that I mark almost everything on my mapping system. So I pin any rubs, scrapes. If I find any tracks that look like a definite buck sign just by the size of them, and then I usually don't mark, scat and whatnot. I just kind of make a mental note like, yep, okay, or 1 + 1 = 2. And again, a lot of times if I find a bunch of sign on a certain, elevation of, I usually follow that contour line. And a lot of times that deer sign will, follow along with that contour line. So in regards to that too, again, I mark almost everything to, be able to analyze it later. Again, I don't know if it's just me, but I hear hunters that can almost have a complete breakdown of a spot, just by going in there one time. Me, I usually have to sit there and kind of him and haw over and analyze it a little bit longer. And quite often I won't really feel confident with the spot until I've gone there a couple different times and scouted a couple different times during the year to really feel like I got a good grasp of what's going on. The other thing is make sure, when you're doing your e-scouting, to keep in mind that, a lot of times those maps don't get updated. They don't get updated as, often as you might think. And so you'll, come into a spot. Same thing happened again to me this year. An area that I'd hunted several years ago, and it was very thick, dense cover, a bunch of, mixed timber. And I went out there, I was scouting my way towards that area, knowing that there was kind of like an older, like an old rye field that the DNR had planted. And so I was like, okay, I'll scout my way to there and scout my way to this food source. I get, about 300-400 yards away, and all of a sudden I come up to where I start seeing daylight. Sure enough, they did a massive clear cut around this old rye field, and kind of changed what my expectation was of the area in regards to how close I was going to be to that rye field before coming out of the timber, coming out of the cover. Because just inside that wood line is where I found a lot of good buck sign. And now, looking at the distance between where that rye field is to how far or how much open ground is between that and the cover now, it's going to be a little bit harder to, kind of hug that food source, I guess I should say. Now with it having a lot larger area, those deer are going to be able to wander a lot more over that larger area. That's going to be a massive food source in a couple of years from now. But they're just able to now to spread out a lot more and not be as concentrated in a smaller area. The other thing is too is like when you look at some mats, you'll looks like a relatively open, clear cut. You go there and all of a sudden you get all the regenerative growth that's come in there. I ran into, again, same thing just recently. What looks like a relatively open clear cut. Go in there and it's basically a bunch of pine saplings that have come up now that are really starting to get in thick now. So it ended up being more so another good cover area than an open food source area. There's a big difference between that 50,000 foot view and then the 50-foot view. So keep that in mind that you're just sometimes going to run into spots that, again, are just going to be completely a bust just because it's not what the map showed it was to be. The other thing too is this time of year is that you find sign now, it doesn't mean it's going to translate to deer movement during season. Some new sign that gets laid out, it may not necessarily be where they stay during the fall time. A lot of that falls into kind of where the deer are staying, where they're bedding, and what they're focused on their food sources now compared to during the fall time. So the other thing I focus on too is kind of once I've kind of gotten the general area in regards to the cover and the terrain. Next, I'm looking at what are the food sources. So my favorite one to really find is anything green. So again, if you're looking at fields and clear cuts, looking for grasses, clovers, any grains, and again, this kind of miscellaneous broadleaf weeds that are growing in there. I focus a lot around near or in cedar swamps. So again, the cedar swamps are going to hold a lot of moisture, and they just seem to kind of hold heat a little bit, just the way they have that thermal cover. So they often hold green vegetation longer and they green up faster. So, I don't get, I'm not usually looking at a massive food source in those cedar swamps, but I do notice that, hey, there's usually some green growing in there, and deer will, still nibble on that stuff in those areas. So if you're in and around them, you can kind of focus on what looks like those browse lines of anything that is growing up and focus on that. The other thing I really, really like to focus on is woody browse. So I've gotten much better at being able to identify, browse lines and what deer are browsing, and being able to more identify what those plants are. So now as I go out, time and time again, I'm able to pinpoint those different plants and recognize that browse without really having to do a ton of analyzing or pausing to really get an idea of what's going on. A lot of times I'm just walking down a trail now and like, oh, yep, there's browse, and just I'm able to keep moving. Again, when I first started doing that, was not the case. I definitely had to go a lot slower. I actually felt like I had a hard time being able to really recognize that. But a lot of that just has time to do with time in the woods and just seeing it time and time again. Much of the deer's diet during the winter, fall and winter months is going to be woody browse, especially those midday browsing areas back in the cover before they go out and expand into more open areas where they have more of their destination food sources for the evening. Again, we're looking at saplings, poplar, maple, oaks, cedar, hemlock, beech, sassafras. Those types of plants are going to be areas that you're going to see a lot of. More often you're going to see that woody browse or those browse. You're going to see a lot more of the browse on those types of plants. So, at least the ones that are in the area that I've noticed the most. So, and it's going to range from anything. So, a freshly down tree, those branches or those ends of those branches are going to be nipped off. You may even see that if it's been historically browsed on, you might see like that main stem that comes off the plant has been nipped off and it's trying to branch off other stems off of that, and those may even be nipped off. So you may even see where the plant has tried to regrow several times and they just keep nipping off that fresh growth. If you have a bunch of saplings that are in the area that are roughly all about the same age, you're going to be able to identify that much quicker because you're just going to be able to see like basically that height difference in between those, or comparison to the plants around them. You're going to see some of the plants are going to be growing very tall, really bushy, lots of branches, and you're going to see others that seem like they're just stunted, or that they're shorter, or that they don't have as many branches, or their branches don't reach out as far. Those are things that are starting to pick up on more and more, being able to just recognize those browse areas, those browse lines. And I usually see them right out the get-go on some form of primary trail. Any main trail that cuts through, an area that has some saplings, they're just kind of nipping them as they go along. And then the other one is around those staging areas inside the timber on, near field edges and whatnot. The other one I really like to see too are if there's shrubs or berries. So we're looking at, the different plants that I'm really looking at is red osier dogwood, elderberry, winterberry, mulberry, blueberries, and then also one that's going to be probably the most common is briars, blackberries, raspberries. Probably the ones I see the most browse typically on is the red osier dogwood. Again, I'm usually hunting kind of in the more lowland areas where there's more water and whatnot. So there's a lot of red osier dogwood hanging around. Those get browsed a ton, at least from my observations. The raspberry bushes or the briars, blackberry, raspberry, whichever they are. Again, I really get excited if I'm in an area that isn't thick covered, that I feel is would be a bedding area. So whether I've got a bunch of rubs and scrapes in the area or have found some beds, if I find there's briars around in that same area too, I get really excited knowing that, hey, this is going to be a food source for them. When they're in their bedding area, they're going to be feeling comfortable in there while they're eating. I really look forward to using this as an ambush spot, which, again, there's a spot that I've scouted or hunted a little bit last year. Never really got into it during the prime part of the season. Again, an area that I've kind of, convinced myself that this is a buck's kind of bedding area, maybe their staging area where they kind of hang out. Basically, I was in there during hunt season, caught 2 bucks on their feet. It was like 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning, and they were just in there browsing, kind of milling around. So the idea is to get in there and kind of ambush them in that spot. Again, in an area where they're back out of, an area that's not easy to get to. There's good cover. I found lots of rubs, lots of scrapes in there, several trails coming in there. And then also a patch of briars where there's plenty of deadfalls. So they got a nice food source. There's other like kind of weeds and other things growing in there, other forbs. So it's a really good food source in there for them that I'm going to hopefully, have to get in there and get some cameras in there to confirm this. But the idea is that these deer are going to be in there, during daylight hours, up on their feet, moving around. At least that's the goal anyways. So the next one too is looking at the forbs, or again, more natural forbs. You're looking at different weeds. So pokeweed, ragweed, wild strawberry, goldenrod, another good one. Now with these ones too, again, it's going to be a little bit tricky this time of year where You may still find some of the stems that are up, but they may be so degraded that you may not recognize them right now. You may start to see that fresh growth coming in. Now these I really like to focus on too, during more so that's going to be more during the earlier part of the season or in early season, early to mid maybe. Again, once they kind of brown out and die down for the season, they're not going to have as much of a draw. Now they could, if they still have, if they seed it out and they still have seeds on them, then you'll see deer kind of nip the seeds off, nip the seed heads off of them. Again, I like to see it during knowing that it's going to be a food source for them early in the season. So if you're looking at something that, early to mid season before everything starts to brown, that's one area that I'm trying to focus on more. I've never been really strong in the early season when it comes, especially, getting on bucks and whatnot. It's not till about mid-October before I actually start feeling like I'm in the game. So by focusing on some of those other food sources, I know they're going to be still, desirable, during that early season. It's something I'm going to be focusing on more this year. And then the other one is, the other food source we're looking at is hard mass and soft mass. So the hard mass is kind of really the big one is oaks again. Most of this, again, the white oaks are going to be the more desirable ones. So if they start dropping, or if you have a known oak tree that's going to be dropping, that's one that you really want to focus on. They're highly desirable. They don't last long, so deer know that they have to get on them and eat them up before they start to basically break down. They break down very quickly. They can actually, go bad in a few days worth of time. I really pay attention to islands of oaks. So sometimes you get in areas where there's just oak trees everywhere. Those are going to be, at least for me, very hard to hunt because, trying to pinpoint which tree is going to be the one that's the best. I try to, I haven't really focused on areas that I know are like that. I usually focus on areas that, is either going to be, a lone oak tree in an area that's no other oaks around it, or, very few anyways, or there's like a small pocket of oaks that are all kind of bunched together, that are going to draw a bunch of deer in. So again, those white oaks going to produce every year as long as they don't get frosted out or die out or anything like that. Again, very good for the early to mid season. The other one I really like to see too is red oaks. Red oaks, again, you might even still find a few of them still on the tree, or not on the tree, on the ground, and still intact. They're not as desirable. Again, what they say is that they're a little bit more bitter for deer palate, so they're not gonna jump on those red oaks like they do the white oaks. But the thing is that's really good about them is one, that they stay hard, or basically stay good longer throughout the course of the season. So two, the good thing about the red oaks is that they're going to, once they drop, they stay good on the ground for a much longer period of time than those white oaks do. So they can actually last throughout the season. But then once late season hits, like, they are big. Like, I don't know how many times I've, been scouting late season and then come up on, a big old massive oak tree, and just the ground, the leaves, the snow, everything's all dug up because deer and other animals have been digging in that snow, getting after those red oak or those acorns. Again, if you don't have any other hard mass or other oaks in the area, deer will still eat those red oaks during the early season. But man, they seem to really, really go after them during the late season. Once some of those other food sources are gone. One thing to make note about those red oaks too is that they produce every other year. So it's a 2-year process for them to produce. So if you found a bunch of red oaks under an oak tree one year, you're not going to find them. The next year, it'd be the year after. And then of course you do have the other types of hard mass. You've got beech nuts, chestnut, walnut. There's probably others I'm not thinking of right now, but those ones are available too. So if you do find an area where those types of essentially seeds are available, you can focus on those as well, but they're not going to be the draw that the oaks are. But certainly keep them in mind, especially too if you see that there has been a lot of deer feeding in those areas or under those trees essentially. Next one is that I love to find, especially when I'm out scouting on public land, is soft mass. So apples, pears, persimmons, crabapple. I love stumbling upon these while out scouting. It's kind of one of those things like, hey, where fruit, deer will eat. So if there's fruit being produced on those fruit trees, deer are gonna come and eat them. It's no question on that. The only interesting thing, or the only thing I sometimes wonder, is that when the deer actually show up and feed on those. So are they going to be there during daylight, or do they come there at night? So that's one thing I kind of keep in the back of my mind in regards to both, even the hard mass or versus the soft mass, is I'm always concerned about when those feeding, or when those activities of feeding or concentrations of feeding occur under those trees. So the other thing to keep in mind too is that non-natives do green early, and they generally hold green later. But they're, you may see deer feed on them, but they're really not a good source, or considered a good source of food for deer. Now, deer will feed on what they have to. Sometimes they may even browse something that they're not really, supposed to like, and they may, chow it down. But overall, if you find something that greened up very early, or is holding green late in the season, then there's probably a non-native plant that you can take advantage of it, but it's something that you're really not going to probably find a ton of success focusing on. And the other thing that I do too, again, for some of these plant species that again, I may not know all what I'm trying to identify here. So using some form of plant ID app, really easy to quickly identify the type of plant that you're looking at. I really like to use it too on the private ground that I hunt, for looking at if it's a native, non-native, considered an invasive species, something that I may have to be concerned about later. So in the final notes on this, I really make a note of any deer sign that I see. So again, I put a lot of pins down, especially for a new area that I'm scouting. Basically any known rub or scrape, I will mark. Any trails, I will mark them. Any beds, I will mark them. Food sources, I will mark those as well. That way I can go back later and kind of analyze it, look at look at that 50,000 foot view and kind of see the big picture. And the other thing I always try to keep back in mind too is that, there's no guarantee that scouting trip or that sign is going to be, it will produce for next year, or for the next season, I guess I should say. The environment and patterns will change. So again, there may be, an egg field, not too far away, that they change what they're growing in there, changes the feeding patterns, changes the draw of that food source. Again, you may come into an area that you had scouted this spring, that you go in this fall, and all of a sudden they're doing a big logging operation and changes everything around. And then also too, doing scouting this time of year, if you're not running cameras, then you can find all the sign you need in the world, but you have no guarantee on if it's going to be daylight movement or not. So you can certainly make your best guess on the proximity to where you consider the bedding to be versus food, and kind of where you're at in between that, those two essentially. But again, you just never know exactly what the actual deer movement is until it gets into the season. Then you can do some observations, in real time. And then again, what I'm looking at for spring scouting is getting a baseline of any new area. I typically have kind of my designated areas that I really focus on year after year, but I do get a little bit of wanderlust and want to try expanding and looking at new areas. And then also too is if I for those core areas that I hunt already, then I do expand out from them, try to again get a bigger and bigger picture of the area. And then also too, confirming assumptions. So that goes a lot with me expanding on areas that I've scouted once before. So I start finding some areas. I start thinking, okay, I found these rubs here or this scrape here. There's looks like this food source here. This is where the bedding I think is. Start looking at okay, if that's that may not be the main bedding area. Let's explore and find another bedding area or see this other area that could hold more bedding as well. Or maybe there's other food stores further to the south or something like that. Just trying to make sure that you kind of get the big picture again, utilizing that phrase again of, making sure I'm not missing anything in regards to, in my scouting. There's been time and time again where I've scouted an area, I think I had it all figured out. And then, 100 yards away, there's, some like, water source or again, a fruit tree or something that's in the area that kind of changes like, oh, the whole dynamic of the area of what I thought was true. All of a sudden, this other factor comes into play that could be changing the whole dynamic of how I think the deer are utilized in the landscape. And then, again, from there, just building that game plan for the upcoming season. Again, when scouting, I'm making a lot of assumptions of what I think is going to occur, how I think the deer are going to move based on the sign. Again, there's a lot of different ways that people analyze or break down a property or hunting area. So this is again just kind of what I think about when it comes to approaching a property or scouting. Again, a lot of it may be kind of elementary or very base level for some hunters. But again, this is a lot of just kind of what I keep in the back of my mind at all times whenever I'm looking at a spot, wanting to scout. And again, the more and more I go out, the more comfortable I become of being able to recognize, oh, there's a rub, there's a scrape, there's a bed, this is browse. If you listen to the show for any period of time, you know that I've talked about scouting before and how I used to struggle to really find scrapes. I could find rubs all day long, but then just being able to identify and find scrapes, it just seemed like I struggled with it. Now it seems like, almost, kind of toot my own horn, I guess, a little bit in this regard. I would say probably 75% of the time when I kind of pick a new spot that I want to scout, I generally find the sign that I'm looking for. Now, not always is it in the exact spot I thought it would be, but a lot of times it leads me to the spot that's a little bit better. So, again, and a lot of that just comes down to this time in the woods, time staring at maps. And again, a lot of this and just, building up that woodsmanship and getting better at scouting. But again, we're getting into the more summertime, which I typically don't really change a lot about my tactics on how to scout. I still focus on looking for that fall sign. Now, I know there are other guys that are much more active when it comes to summertime scouting, especially getting eyes on deer. They're either watching field edges or, shining and stuff like that are far better at kind of taking inventory a little bit more, and can recognize, where a deer is during the summer pattern and how that's going to relate to their fall. I haven't really gotten good at that yet. I still have work to do in that regard anyway. So, but, that's it for at least my breakdown of how I approach spring scouting. Again, we're at that cusp of, with the leaves starting to come on the trees and whatnot, it makes it a little bit harder. So I only got a couple more, trips of really scouting, but I would consider my spring, go-to, and then we go into summer. So the other thing is we're looking at, it's May, so I'm going to be looking at doing my springtime food plot program, which I plan on doing another episode on that. Again, kind of doing a breakdown of my approach this year, what I'm planning, why I'm planting it, and how I'm going to get it in the ground, essentially. So, but I've rambled enough as it is at the end of this one here, so I'm going to cut it off here. So, again, thank you for listening. Thanks for tuning in. And as always, get out there, be safe, and have fun.